I'm Roy. I work at Dutch butterfly conservation, but I primarily work on dragonflies. And I'm here as one of the board members of Dragonfly Conservation Europe. And I want to talk about why we need something like Dragonfly Conservation Europe and what it actually is. We, of course, all know that there's a big problem with nature conservation. There's a decline in a lot of species occurrences. This is the Living Planet Index indicating how poorly biodiversity is doing globally. There have been a lot of effort to conserve nature, but they've not been very successful, obviously. So what has been done in Europe and what role can dragonflies play? Dragonflies are especially interesting in this case because freshwater biota are doing even worse than the average. And that makes sense because fresh water is where most people live. People like to live close to water because you can drink it and it's easy to transport things on water. But it's also a good way to get rid of your waste. So there's a lot of pollution of fresh water, and climate change also impacts fresh water strongly. A paper by Roel Klink from some years ago more or less indicated that the impact on freshwater insects was less strong as on other groups of freshwater biota. But whether that's also the case for dragonflies is still a bit of a question, although dragonflies are the best studied aquatic insect. So we think if we want to know more about this topic, we should make our data contribute. And we do have a lot of data on dragonflies in Europe. We're called Dragonfly Conservation Europe, which also already indicates that we focus on Europe, not specifically the EU, but the EU is very important for a lot of regulations on nature conservation. So a lot of things are, of course, also related to these EU policies. I know it's a bit of a conflicted situation in the UK with Europe. I don't mean Brexit, I mean this field guide of Britain and Europe, which always puzzles me what is meant by that. I've never seen a field guide for the dragonflies of, for instance, Denmark and Europe. But UK is definitely included in the area we want to work on as DCE. If you think about what the EU is doing, a lot of people are saying, well, all this nature conservation, we can do that ourselves as an individual country. That's not a job for Brussels. The EU should just stick to free trade and trade agreements. But I think that's very short-sighted because if you have free trade, this can very easily work to a race to the bottom. And I can explain what I mean with that with this small example of two toothpaste factories. If you have two toothpaste factories, they both sell toothpaste in their own country. But if one of the two countries reduces regulations on air pollution, this factory can produce more economically and sell cheaper toothpaste. And of course, they can export that to another country, outcompeting the other toothpaste factory. In this toothpaste factory, they of course don't like that. They try to also reduce the regulations in that country, and you will end up with two polluted countries. But they can both sell their own toothpaste. You don't want that. You don't want to be forced to pollute your own country because to keep your economy going. This is a race to the bottom. What you can do, and which is very popular at the moment, is start with tariffs. If you take import tax on toothpaste from this other country, you can protect your own economy, your own industry. But of course, as most people agree, within the EU, free trade is one of the basic things you want to do, so you can't have a tariff. So how do you then solve this race to the bottom? You can do that by making agreements on what you can and cannot do. You have minimum levels for your environmental quality, for your nature, for how you have your labor laws. You have to agree on those things. Without those things, free trade is impossible. So having nature conservation regulations on this larger international scale is essential. You can't have free trade without it. Of course, you have to also be aware that this is an issue. And if you think about water quality, of course, one of the main things of importance for dragonflies, a key moment in European history was a beluga that swam up the Rhine in 1966. Of course, this animal got a lot of attention because how often do you see a beluga in the Rhine in Germany? It's extremely rare event. So a lot of people would go there. It was covered in newspapers, but was also very conspicuous that this animal couldn't survive in the Rhine. The Rhine was extremely polluted, and this animal got sores and blisters, and people were warning that this animal would die because of the poor water quality. And of course, if you realize that, it's ridiculous that your water is so polluted that an animal can't even swim in it without dying. Eventually, the beluga left again and swam into the North Sea, so it didn't die in the Rhine. But this was an eye-opener for a lot of people. We came quite far since then. And eventually, this ended up as the Water Framework Directive, where we have regulations on water quality. In the UK, of course, it's no longer really the Water Framework Directive, but it still exists as the Water Environment Regulations, in a slightly different form. And there's a lot of regulations to improve this water quality. Biological quality, so which animals live there, there's a kind of quality matrix for that. Hydromorphological quality, a stream shouldn't be just a gutter, but should have bands and sandbanks and stuff like that. Physical chemical quality, that's stuff like pH, oxygen level, and chemical quality, the classical pollutants, the pesticides and things like that. This has helped. This has reduced pollution quite severely, especially pollution by sewage, a lot of restoration of streams, but it's not perfect. There are quite some issues with the Water Framework Directive. One of it is that by no means we're going to reach a good status at the deadline. The deadline used to be 2015 at first, but it has been postponed twice and is now 2027. But we already know that about 90% of the river basins in Europe will fail. They're just not good enough. We didn't do enough. Another problem is also that we have only derived biodiversity indicators. So you use different species that like better or worse water qualities to give an indication of the biodiversity quality, but you're not looking at the individual species. So you miss a lot of changes. And I think, especially for dragonflies, an important part is that it focuses on large lakes, larger than 50 hectares, and rivers with substantial watersheds. So a lot of the habitats of dragonflies, like this pond on the bottom right, they're not even covered in the Water Framework Directive. So people always think that the Water Framework Directive protects fresh waters in Europe. It does, but only a subset. It's helpful, but incomplete. Another important set of legislations is the Habitat Directive, Natura 2000. It's for the protection of specific habitats and specific species. And the essence of Natura 2000 is that it's a network of reserves with targets for selected species and selected habitats. This does include some dragonfly species, and it does include some dragonfly habitats. Of course, it's also not representative of all habitats. They have quite a few fens and running waters. We have species that are protected, like this Leucorinia albifrons. But there's a very strong overrepresentation of West and Central European species. And if you compare the species that are protected under the Habitat Directive with the species on the red list that Geert just presented, there is very little overlap. So in that sense, we're protecting the wrong species. Of course, there are other groups besides dragonflies on the Habitat Directive as well, but there are very few aquatic species, so there's not a lot of overlap there in habitat. So the species that need protection most are not covered, which is of course a big issue. Also, a lot of habitats are protected directly on the Habitat Directive. This includes also fen ecosystems, heathland ponds, several types, peat bogs, springs and streams. And these all have targets for area and quality. So you have to protect those and very often also improve the quality of these habitats. And dragonflies can be designated as an indicator of quality. That has been done by some countries. So you really measure the quality of a habitat by the presence of these species. And this can, of course, protect these species directly. But if you protect the habitat, you can also protect them indirectly. And of course, if you have a moorland hawker, if you want to protect moorland hawker, you shouldn't protect the individual organism, you should protect the habitat. If you want to protect wolves, the most important thing is not shoot them, but for dragonflies, it's not about the individual, it's about the habitat. So did these things work? Well, the Habitat Directive and the Water Framework Directive definitely had a big positive impact. It prevented stronger declines. It helped certain species like the Siberian damselfly, which is very rare, but also protected. So there are very much targeted efforts for that species. But is it enough for freshwater biodiversity? Well, the Water Framework Directive, as I said, mostly focuses on lakes and rivers, so it misses a lot. And doesn't really do biodiversity monitoring. And the Habitat Directive, it's only specific species and habitats. So it kind of misses things. And of course, I'm not the only person who realizes that. We know that we actually have a very poor insight in how European biodiversity is doing. We have some indicators. The grassland butterfly indicator is a well-known one. There's a set of butterflies that are restricted to grassland habitats. We monitor those and we can calculate a trend for the whole of Europe. And as you can see in this graph, they're not doing well. There's also an indicator for common farmland birds, which is a kind of a similar way to calculate an indicator, but that's it. So there's nothing aquatic. And I think that would be a great role for dragonflies as an indicator for how, especially all these smaller water bodies are doing. Of course, if you want to do that, we have to be able to calculate trends on a European level, and they have to be good indicators. And then the question arises, can these dragonflies function as sentinels for these freshwater habitats? Well, I'm sure the next speaker will talk a lot about that, so I won't say that much. But we know we can do a lot with monitoring. And this monitoring can give us trends, and we can make nice graphs. These are graphs for different species in the Netherlands. And this tells us a lot about each individual species, which of course is interesting, but they tell us a lot more when you take them together. They can look at changing communities and look at how different traits influence how species are doing. This is an example of that. This is also a plot for the Netherlands where you can see how, on average, the species from running waters are doing. They increase for a while. That is Water Framework Directive, sewage treatment plants, but it more or less leveled off. The species of more eutrophic waters are doing quite well. The species of oligotrophic waters, so the peat bogs and the heathland ponds, they were doing quite okay, but have been declining, just like Geert already told, for the whole of Europe. So this really shows some interesting patterns. If you're looking at trends, you always have to be very careful what you're showing. If you have a lot of records, you can still make a mistake by just looking at the number of records and interpret that as a trend, but that's very unreliable because in almost all countries you have a very, very strong increase in the number of records. That doesn't say anything about the number of dragonflies, of course. It mostly says something about the number of observers. So we need to correct for this effort. And we need to know that the likelihood that a species is seen somewhere is based on whether it's present. If it's not there, you can't see it, but also on how well people looked. So we have to have more metadata to know how people recorded these things, and also know when people have looked for dragonflies somewhere but didn't see a species. So we can calculate these trends. We know that water quality was a very big driver for community change. We know that now climate change dominates these trends positively, but increasingly also negatively, with the drought for these Mediterranean running water species, but also becoming too hot for a lot of the northern species like this black darter that's very quickly declining in large parts of Europe. But we can also look at other traits, of course. And what makes dragonflies really great as indicators that they respond very quickly. They respond negatively. They disappear when things become unsuitable. That's easy. Almost all organisms do that. But they also respond positively, like this lily pad whiteface that recovered a large part of its distribution the recent years because of improvement of water quality and improvement of water vegetation. What's also great is that for a large part of Europe, we also have already have quite a bit of data. So this would be a very valuable addition to existing monitoring of the butterflies and farmland birds. And this would give us a lot of insight in freshwater biodiversity. So I would very much like a European pond dragonfly indicator in the same sense as this grassland butterfly indicator. And the nature restoration law is also giving us ways to do this. The nature restoration law wants to go from conservation to restoration. We shouldn't only stop things deteriorating, they should improve. So we have to restore habitats. We have to restore a lot of rivers. Use of pesticides should be reduced. We have to increase biodiversity in agriculture and reverse the decline of pollinators. And we have to show that these things are working in the nature restoration law. So we have to have these biodiversity indicators. Monitoring is definitely needed, and that's very clear in this law. And so we now have this grassland butterfly indicator, and we can extend from that. Of course, when the nature restoration law was developed, people were already working on how to develop these indicators. Spring has been a project where we looked at pollinators and how to monitor pollinators. But in the Europa Bond project that Geert already mentioned, there are already some lists of what should be measured, and dragonflies are very much on that because they are also indicative of all these smaller freshwater bodies. So we know that there is a need for these kind of indicators, and dragonflies can fulfill that role, but how do we get dragonflies on this agenda? Well, currently these plans are being drawn. We know we can use them, but do they know? And of course, we have to tell them what they need to know and how to monitor these things. The selection of these indicators will be the coming years. So we need to show that dragonflies are very nicely complementary to what has already been done and that they are good indicators. But this is a great opportunity, a great moment to stimulate the study of dragonflies in Europe and eventually their protection. The new red list is, of course, also a very good starting point for that. What we need is to develop these indicators further, further develop modern monitoring tools like timed counts that you can use, like the butterfly count app, where you count for 15 minutes and you indicate that you already count, that you count all the species in the group that you indicated. So you not only record the nice species, but you really record everything. And we have to develop better analytical techniques. But of course, even if we are able to do that, that's still not enough. We need to have advocacy and a European contact. And that always has been a problem because we have a lot of different organizations within Europe working on dragonfly conservation, like the British Dragonfly Society, but also the Slovene Dragonfly Society, OP in France, GDÖ in Germany and Austria. But if someone from the EU wants to contact someone to say, okay, we're interested in monitoring dragonflies, who can we call? There was no one there. It's more or less the Kissinger problem. If I want to talk about European dragonflies, who do I call? We needed a contact point. And of course, that means a European dragonfly organization. But we can do more. You have all these societies, all these groups of people. They all work on dragonflies in their own part of Europe, but they run into similar problems on data management, analyses, stuff like that. We can help each other. And we can also work on better data availability. For the last red list assessment, we had to gather a lot of these databases and make them talk to each other and check them all. And that's a lot of work. It would be great if for the next round of these red list assessments, we would have a more centralized database and not have to do this all over again. But also for other analyses, it would be great to have this data available and not just stored locally on a laptop. In the Project Dragon, people are working on that. Lisa is doing that, who is also in this meeting. And she's, for instance, now working on trade analyses and looking at which trades of dragonflies correlate with how they're doing in Europe. So to go from records to conservation, we need to show that these dragonflies are uniquely suitable to gain insight in freshwater ecosystems and help dragonflies and their habitat. We now need to convince the rest of the world. We founded Dragonfly Conservation to do that at ECO in Andalusia this summer. And we're now just starting to do these kind of things. So we're really in our infancy. But it has been founded and we're starting running. Of course, the A2P project that Geert just talked about is already kind of a start of how this works, bringing a lot of these people together, discussing what we have to do for dragonflies in Europe, and going further than just our individual local problems. Okay, what is Dragonfly Conservation Europe now that it's founded? In essence, I think it's a network of European ornithologists. And this network already existed. That's not new. It's just a formalization and a strengthening of these contacts. And one of the focal points of this network has already for many years been the European Congress on Ornithology. This is a group picture of the last meeting in Spain. But beside that, we also produce a newsletter. There has been one issue this last autumn, and there will be another one this spring. So this is the group where we started ECO with in Spain this summer. Well, what is Dragonfly Conservation Europe formally? Well, it's a Dutch foundation, so it's really a legal entity. We have a website and we have an email address. We can be contacted, and that is basically for the outside world, but also for the Dragonfly network ourselves. Why a foundation? A foundation is very simple. You have quite a few tax exempts, and there's very little bureaucracy in comparison with a society. Well, we do have a board with representatives from different parts of Europe. And although we don't have members like a society, we do want to discuss our activities at these ECO meetings every second year to discuss what the network of people want and just to tell what we're doing and have feedback on it. The current board is this list of people. You can see on this map, it's quite widespread over Europe. There are 3 dots in the northwest. That's Geert, that you just saw, Klaus-Jürgen Kunze from Germany, and myself. That's because to start a foundation, you have to go to a notary, and it's not a lot of fun to go to a notary. And we didn't want to have people traveling all the way from, for instance, Crete to the Netherlands to sit in a boring office. So we just had 3 people together, and then with those 3, we founded it and then added other board members. So how can you participate? Well, we have this small number of board members. They do the boring stuff, running the organization. And because of that, it has to be a limited number of people. Otherwise, it, of course, becomes very complicated. There are observers, so people who are informed by the board on what's going on. They can also join meetings. And you can be a subscriber to the newsletter. They just get the interesting things, not the boring stuff, only the news and information on dragonflies. So this DCE newsletter will be published twice a year with news and updates. And when I say news, I don't mean things like, I found a new dragonfly species for Europe, like this Kazuma pincer tail. No, more things like, last year, we saw a lot of 4-spotted chasers with a lot of black in their wings, the form Pernibula. Was that also the case in different countries? Now, I asked that question on ECO last summer, and a lot of people said, yeah, in Poland it was the same thing. In Sweden, yeah, we also saw a lot of that form. So apparently, this was something across Europe. That's not worthwhile to write a scientific paper about, but still something I like to know, and the newsletter is a nice way to ask those questions. Something that you might also have spotted already on this photo, and is also interesting, I think, in the UK perspective, is these little critters. There you have this dragonfly feeding midges. They feed on hemolymph on the veins of dragonflies, and they are rarely spotted. I don't think they're rare. People just don't record them. And also in the UK, there have been a few records. I'm pretty sure they're more common, They are mostly active in spring, so look out for them in the coming months. And maybe you can write a nice article about that for the newsletter. And of course, in this newsletter, you can also ask questions to other people or ask data, like these kind of things. Do you have this midge also in your area? If you want to subscribe to the newsletter, just send an email through info@europeandragonflies.com. Then I'll add you to the mailing list. Another thing, of course, we're not called European Dragonfly Conservation for nothing. We also want to support conservation initiatives. Bring people with questions for conservation and people with expertise that can help this in contact with each other. Well, that can be, for instance, the help with methods or analysis, how to analyze data, or finding funding. One of the things we already did is help with finding funding for a project on the Greek red damselfly. That's an extremely rare species that only occurs in a few spots in Greece and is critically endangered. This spring, people will go looking for them, see where they still occur, and describe the habitat, and also possibly conservation initiatives. I already mentioned that ECO has been around for a while and is very important for the European dragonfly community. It always had a very informal structure. In essence, it was always organized by some people, and during an ECO meeting, they would ask someone, well, isn't it about time that you would organize one? And then someone was convinced, and then you made sure that in 2 years there was a new ECO meeting. That worked out, but it's not very reliable. So DCE wants to support the organization of ECO, and ECO is more or less the home of DCE as an organization. The next ECO meeting will be in Poland in 2026, and of course, you're all very welcome to join there if you want to hear a lot of interesting talks about dragonflies. And with these meetings, there's also always a field trip involved. Very nice to look around in Poland to look at dragonflies. Dragonfly Conservation Europe is now also a good way to connect with other ornithologists, a contact point for international organizations, but in the future we want to be more. Our website, europeandragonflies.com, should become a hub for dragonfly knowledge, including data, protocols, traits, ecology, statistical methods, and things like that. But that's something we really have to develop further, and it's not there at the moment. Dragonfly Conservation Europe definitely depends on participation. So I also like to ask you, what do you think would help to protect dragonflies in Europe? If you have any ideas, come to us. But also, if you have any ideas how to contribute yourself, let me know. And if you need help, if you have problems with data analysis, conservation ideas that you have to work out, but you're stuck in, you need input from other people, monitoring protocols, anything like that, let me know. Just email us at info@europeandragonflies.com, where you can also subscribe for the newsletter. Thank you very much. And I hope to see at least some of you at ECO in Poland, where we'll definitely be looking for this beautiful damselfly, the sedgeling. Thank you.